talking about some of the reactions to the New Deal programs. So you definitely had a reaction both from the left and the right. There were some people from the right that made the argument that the New Deal was essentially a socialist program. And it was certainly a program that involved much more government involvement in the economy. If that is socialist, to a certain extent, you could make the argument that this is somewhat accurate. Certain programs certainly provided more welfare assistance than we'd ever seen before. And actually, the New Deal is going to take an even more leftward direction, which we'll get to in the next slide. And one could make the argument that that is even more resembling of socialism once we get to that point. Then there are other people that make the argument that the New Deal did not go far enough. So some people said it was kind of timid. There are many examples of that. One is Upton Sinclair, who is probably familiar to you because he was the muckraking author of The Jungle, right? The book that exposed some of the very bad conditions in the meatpacking industry. At this point in 1936, Upton Sinclair is running for governor of California, and his plan was to establish a government-run production system, which would be like essentially a socialist system, right? If the government was completely controlling production, that's socialism, right? I mean, like we already saw that with the National Industrial Recovery Act, the government has the ability to step in and regulate some elements of industry, right? This would be like an all-encompassing government-run production system entirely. Now, Upton Sinclair does not win the gubernatorial race, but he garners a lot of support from the Democratic Party, which is major because we do start to see that one of the other legacies of the Great Depression is that there's sort of a party realignment that's taking place, and people that start to support more government intervention in things like the economy tend to gravitate more towards the Democratic Party now. And as you probably remember from the progressive era, that was not necessarily the case, right? So this is a major realignment that we see. Other people that say that FDR did not go far enough, another good example would be a man named Francis Townsend, who argued that that the government should be providing a pension to all of the elderly citizens. So he wanted the government to give $200 a month to all citizens over 60 years old, on the condition that they would spend most of that money. I forget exactly how much. The point to that would be A, that the elderly would not suffer unduly, but then B, they would stimulate the economy because they would be mandated to spend this money that they were given. Now that plan doesn't go through. And then you have Huey Long, who was a governor and senator from, he was a governor later of Louisiana. At that point, he was a senator. And he instituted a program called Share Our Wealth. And it was a wealth redistribution program that was designed for Louisiana. So this, again, is much more socialistic sounding, just in the sense that they actually wanted to take the possessions of people, like the capital of people, and sort of move it around. But Huey Long was assassinated in 1936, and there was talk about Huey Long actually running as a third-party candidate against Roosevelt in the 1936 election. So obviously that didn't happen since Long was assassinated. So in any case, you see that there's criticism coming from both the left and the right. FDR does push a little bit farther left in his New Deal programs by 1935 or so. We see this very much exemplified by the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. This was established in 1935. And again, like some of the programs we've already seen, a lot of these alphabet soup programs, I like to call them that, like WPA, CCC, a lot of them are simply providing public works employment, right? So the WPA does the same thing. It's giving 8.5 million people, mostly unskilled men, jobs in public works programs. So basically they're doing things like making parks, building bridges, building schools, right? They're building a lot of resources for local and state government organizations, right? Basically, almost every community in the country was affected by the Works Progress Administration because so many projects were built. The goal was to provide a full-time job for at least one person in all families whose breadwinner was suffering from unemployment. So just like the programs we saw during the 100 days, the WPA is really trying to restore confidence by getting more people out and working, not necessarily making them make a tremendous amount of money. The WPA ends up being dissolved in 1943. And the reason why that is because at that point we were in the midst of World War II and the unemployment rate was so low that it wasn't needed anymore. Another major accomplishment of the New Deal programs that we can certainly relate to today is that the Social Security Act created the Social Security system that we still have now. We tend to associate Social Security with welfare programs that are given mainly towards the elderly, which is still the case. So basically it provided some modest services to the elderly as well as some welfare benefits. This was the first federal assistance program for the elderly that was ever enacted in U.S. history. And this is something that is still, although it does not 100% provide for the elderly population, it certainly does still provide financial assistance for people of retirement age. One of the problems that we're seeing with the Social Security Administration now, though, is that there's such a large number of people retiring at this point due to the baby boomer generation that it seems difficult for the Social Security program to remain sustainable. But nonetheless, this is something that is incredibly popular, obviously, by senior citizens, and it is something that has a legacy back to the Great Depression. The Wagner Act was an important step for helping unions organize. Basically, it was an act that protected workers' rights to organize unions. So again, you really see a moving away from that laissez-faire practice that you saw so common in the 1920s economic policy. And then another program that was really limited, but it showed you an experiment at the very least. It was sort of overly ambitious. But the Resettlement Administration, the idea behind that was to try to relocate poor farm families, basically, with the result of the Dust Bowl in particular, which we're going to talk about in a future slide. The Resettlement Administration was meant to get people out of these overly exhausted areas of land, right? Provide relief camps for migratory workers. But it did not actually reach that many people in need. But nonetheless, we do get a sense that FDR was very liberal in terms of expanding the New Deal program to try to help as many people as possible. You're also going to see that increasingly you're going to have really a leftward push of the people, not just of FDR himself. You may remember the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which was formed during the populist progressive era. The AFL during the Depression is going to merge with a group called the Committee for Industrial Organization, or the CIO, right? It's going to become the AFLCIO. And the people in the AFL that merged with the CIO tended to be sort of the more militant side of the AFL. The purpose of the AFL-CIO was to organize mass production workers. It was led by John Lewis, who led the United Mine Workers. And basically it drew a lot of communists and other radicals to engage in the really dangerous task of building industrial unions. And one of the examples of a success of the AFL-CIO was that in Flint, Michigan, you had at the General Motors plant, you had a major strike. It was called a sit-down strike because people showed up at work but then sat there and didn't do anything. So you see them sitting here. And this led to major victories both in the automotive industry as well as other industries. The successful sit-down strike basically led to greater unionization of the U.S. automobile industry. So the fact that people were turning a little bit farther left as well certainly shows you that that sort of deregulation and laissez-faire economic style of the 1920s was rapidly falling out of favor. All right, so in 1936, we get a sense of how people actually feel about Roosevelt's performance and about the New Deal programs. In a lot of ways, the invigorated labor movement was one of the major reasons why FDR's New Deal coalition was really successful. You're going to see that in 1936, FDR easily wins the re-election. In fact, he wins it more handily in 1936 than he did in 1932 when he was running against Hoover. The supporters of FDR are starting to change slightly, so we are seeing a party realignment take place. So on the one hand, we have traditional white Southern Democrats. So we have, a lot of the people who were Democrats way back during the Reconstruction era. But then you're also seeing big city political machines start to turn out for Roosevelt. You're going to see trade unionists. You're also going to see a lot of Westerners, so Depression hit farmers. And you're also going to see racial and ethnic minorities start to vote increasingly for Roosevelt. So there's definitely a shift taking place in the nature of the Democratic Party. All right, so I said I would mention the Dust Bowl. I mentioned it briefly before. Let's get to it. So the Dust Bowl was basically a culmination of the really poor agricultural practices that were conducted in the West. And its timing was terrible because already we know that the farmers were really pressed throughout the 20s economically. And in the Great Depression itself, we have a major drought take place, which severely dries up basically the entire Great Plains region. And this event was called the Dust Bowl. So basically it was a culmination of very poor farming methods. These methods strip farmland of its natural vegetation. And what we had were literally dust storms that would devastate towns and oftentimes force people to leave because there was virtually nothing that they could produce and there were no jobs available. So we'll see that the government also is going to try to step in to help the people who have suffered due to the Dust Bowl. So the government programs are going to try to do a lot of the things we've already seen. They're trying to provide relief on the one hand, and then they're also trying to educate farmers to conduct better farming practices in the future so that something like this won't happen again. And so farmers, on the one hand, were actually given increased education. So some of these farmer relief projects were actually meant at better training farmers so that in addition to producing the cash crops, things like tobacco and cotton, they were also meant to produce crops that would enrich soil. So they actually were taught how to be more sustainable farmers. You also had a soil conservation service that was created. And what this did was it actually gave assistance to farmers who engaged directly in conservation work. So if you made a point to help preserve the richness of the soil, you would be given government aid. We already talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We already talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Act, but it is helping with the West in particular because it's providing subsidies to farmers who are reducing the amount of acres that they're farming, right? So an act that was already in place during the 100 days is directly helping Western farmers. One of the limits, though, to the government's involvement in helping Western farmers was that you are going to see that there is a major sense of racism that takes place during the Great Depression. Oftentimes, there's this association of minorities as being the last hired and first hired in an economic crisis. You're going to see that many of the struggling farmers are going to launch aggressive campaigns against Mexicans, Mexican Americans, because ultimately they too are struggling with the environmental conditions of the Dust Bowl. And since white Americans were also suffering and quite poor, they tried to scapegoat Mexican Americans. There was actually a program that took place called repatriation, which deported many Mexicans and Mexican Americans in order to try to provide more jobs for white farmers. So we see that despite the fact that there was, some efforts to try to help alleviate the farming condition, it certainly was not egalitarian. And lastly, I just wanted to say that some farmers, according to the AAA, who were told to reduce the amount of acreage that they were farming, some of them would respond by kicking their tenants and sharecroppers off the land, right? Because basically, sharecroppers and tenant farmers were obviously going to be farming something. And so what you have is all of a sudden, all these former tenant farmers and sharecroppers find themselves out of work. Many of them have no choice but to try to move further west in search of jobs. Some of them get the name called Okies. named after people who come specifically from Oklahoma. Many of them ended up buying like dilapidated cars called jalopies and driving out to California because they heard of these myths of wonderful jobs and great weather out there. Many of them who reached California would be sorely disappointed to find out that the economic situation there was not much better. But nonetheless, this is a major migratory pattern that results from the Dust Bowl. And if you're interested in reading a fictional account of the Dust Bowl and that migration, you should check out John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. All right, another thing that the New Deal is doing is it's attempting to be more efficient with the use of water. And so some of the New Deal water projects, just like the Tennessee Valley Authority, as we saw in a previous video, we're also going to see projects, the biggest of which was the Hoover Dam, which was completed in 1935, which provided for massive urban growth. The Hoover Dam dams the Colorado River Valley, or Colorado River rather, more directly. And what it does is it provides a major source of water to cities like Las Vegas, which is close by, which we know if you've ever been to Las Vegas, you probably know that it's a city that's in the middle of the desert. It's a city that could not exist if it wasn't for the diversion of water from one place to another. So basically, these water projects helped cities in the West grow tremendously when they couldn't naturally. It helped expand agricultural production because they could, irrigate more efficiently. It did also promote flood control. And just like the Tennessee Valley Authority, it provided low-cost electricity. It did cause some people to become immensely wealthy, and other people were sort of exploited from these construction projects. Many migrant laborers ended up working on the Hoover Dam. Working conditions were dangerous. You certainly had people die on the job during this construction. Wages were quite low. And also, one of the major environmental effects of the Hoover Dam was that it changed the ecosystem of the Colorado River Valley. As you can see, obviously, the area upstream of the dam is quite deep. You can also assume that since water backs up against the dam before it goes through the spillway, the water becomes quite cold, and it's warmer here because it runs much faster. And so the types of fish that could survive in the water change dramatically. And eventually, we're also going to see that due to the fact that this water remains stagnant, there's a lot more evaporation. And so if you can see here, you see that this little part of the land that reaches the water is very light at first, and then it gets darker. This is called a bathtub ring, which basically means that the water level used to be up here where the light part ends, but that it simply evaporated since it was sitting there. So it's a major waste of water, actually. All right, we'll do this slide, and then we'll I think actually we can finish it all up in this, so bear with me. The last major element of the New Deal and its effect on the West is that there is going to be a major change in Native American policy, a change that was definitely a long time in coming. John Collier, who we see here, was appointed the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he makes it his job to try to reverse a lot of the harmful practices of previous American Indian policy. So, as you remember, basically from the Indian removal era of Andrew Jackson, well through the end of the 19th century, there was this continuing push of Native Americans off of their native land into reservations. Their sense of sovereignty was severely compromised. And so what John Collier was trying to do is to end the loss of reservation lands and also help Indians establish more self-government. So basically reestablish their sovereignty as people who live in the United States, but people who aren't exactly U.S. citizens and should have some special privileges. One example of that was that the Indian Reorganization Act restored tribal ownership of land, which was a major accomplishment. You are going to see that some tribes rejected the Indian Reorganization Act. So, for example, the Navajo people did not like that because they said that the Bureau was attempting to reduce the amount of livestock that they had. So some people are resistant to it, but nonetheless, others were quite quite positive about the idea that now their tribes could directly own the land again instead of being confined to government-controlled Indian reservations. You're also going to see that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to become more culturally sensitive, and so they're going to make more of an effort to restore tribal rights and try to be sensitive to Indian cultural freedoms. So in any case, even though it's certainly not an absolute 180 in terms of the American conception of Indians, you are going to see a slightly more sympathetic, slightly more accommodating American government towards American Indians for the first time really ever in its history. So that certainly marks a dramatic change. In terms of the New Deal's effect on culture, and this is just a whole bunch of pictures on this slide, but I wanted to be clear on why this is. The New Deal, in addition to just providing jobs that help build infrastructure, also actually helped inspire the development of culture that sort of encapsulated the Great Depression experience. And so there were New Deal programs that actually directly helped aid artists, writers, actors, musicians. So there were actual artistic creations that sort of reflected the Depression that were funded by the government. The most famous instance of this was the New Deal's Federal Project Number 1. And what this did was it provided assistance to artists and individuals. And in its time, it provided $27 million to help give jobs to artists, musicians, writers, and actors. Out of that program, you had the Federal Writers Project, which provided a wide variety of volumes and enabled some of the country's greatest writers to survive because they could write with some help from the government, and also helped many of them become really prominent authors because their accounts oftentimes would really epitomize the Great Depression experience. And again, one of my favorite examples of that is John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which is telling the story of people who were suffering during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and make the long journey to California to try to seek a better life. So I highly recommend that book if you're interested in reading about the Dust Bowl and a unique family's experience. The New Deal also funded theatrical, music, and artistic programs. So you have the Federal Theater Project, which employed thousands and conducted over 200 performances, and about 30 million people got to actually see these plays that were put on. And again, they were subsidized by the federal government. You have more people, thanks to this federal project, start to create documentaries that are recording the extent of human suffering. One of the best examples of that is that the Farm Security Administration actually employed photographers to take pictures of the Depression experience throughout the country. So one of the best examples of this was a photographer named Dorothea Lange, who got this job through the Farm Security Administration and basically traveled throughout rural areas on the government's dime and would take pictures of some of the people that she came across. This was one of her most famous photographs. It's called Migrant Mother, and it shows a woman with 3 of her children. She's holding a baby here. She's only 30-something years old, and her face looks much more weather-worn than that. And it's just, an image of her very unsure of what ultimately she's going to do with these hungry children with no job prospects living in the West in a very poor circumstance. But essentially, in addition to obviously helping generate sympathy and emotion during the Depression, it also helps us today because we can look back and consume, these books, look at these photographs, listen to this music, and really get a true sense of what the mentality of the Great Depression was like. Some of these authors, artists, playwrights, and so on have Marxist interpretations in their works. So you do see some of these pieces focusing a little bit more on class conflict and the failures of capitalism. And some people are a little bit alarmed that there's going to be a rise of fascism. So in general, you're going to have some people try to use literature to try to appeal to anti-fascists by sort of using their writing to create like a popular front to spread their influence. So there were certainly fascists that emerged from the Great Depression era, like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and some of these authors were somewhat responsible for trying to deviate the American public away from taking that route. And I am going to stop after this slide, but this one's related to the last, and then we'll do a very quick video to end here. In terms of culture, in particular movies and radio, hopefully not surprisingly, in a lot of ways, films, radio programs were seen as escapist in nature. So in other words, people really didn't want to, if they were watching a movie or if they were listening to a radio program, they didn't necessarily want to read or see how terrible their lives were. Instead, they wanted something to sort of distract them from the problems of the economy. And so you actually have, screwball comedies emerge. I don't know if these two faces are familiar. This was my dad raised me on these guys. This is Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. They put on a ton of comical movies throughout the Great Depression. They're silly, they're slapstick, they're low budget, but ultimately their personalities put a smile on your face even if you were not feeling too great. And they were very simple stories, kind of just this dynamic duo that I can't really encapsulate it, but I think I should show you just a little clip of one of their movies in class so you get a sense of how a movie like this would brighten someone's day if they were suffering during the Depression. And then, of course, you have Disney proliferating in the 1930s. And most of these tales are sort of more morally uplifting. They stress kind of following the rules, being upbeat. And of course, we know eventually how rapidly the Disney franchise is going to affect all of Americana. The radio is going to increase in popularity. By 1930, about 40% of American homes have radios in them. They're still focused on older forms of entertainment, so they're still recreating vaudeville and blackface minstrelsy shows. You do start to see the creation of, I guess the modern equivalent would be a soap opera. And daytime radio shows. You're going to see the emergence of advice shows, so sort of like advice columns. People would call in with some sort of relationship problem and ask for advice. So this is something that starts to happen during the Depression. And, again, it's kind of uplifting. People who listen to it will get a sense that there are other people out there that have problems just like them. And so there's sort of a relatability factor there. You are going to see the emergence of some more serious and political programs on the radio. So there is going to be an emergence of more network news programs, which is going to be a major source of information for customers. And you're also, of course, going to have the production of music on the radio. So jazz music in particular gets very popular during the Depression. And what's interesting is you're also going to get sort of the crossover between white and black music in the sense that oftentimes music that was initially written by African American artists is going to increasingly get performed or adapted by white artists, which ultimately makes it popular. So you see that there's still definitely a racial sense of discord in terms of cultural consumption, even during the Depression. So the last video I think is going to be really quick, but I do want to just separate it here to give you a break. We'll talk about the decline of the New Deal program and the onset of World War I in the next video.